All right, so this is a really fun group that consists of bony fish. And we learned about Chondrichthyes, which was cartilaginous fish, and now we need to learn about Ostiechthyes, which is the bony fish. So there's a lot of similarities, but really more differences than similarities between this one and the sharks, which we dissected last week. So this is our last group of, so we are in the chordates, we are in the vertebrates, because they do have a backbone and they do have that notochord. And these are fish that do have jaws and we do have bones, but they are still animals that are not super advanced, although we're definitely seeing animals that are more advanced than the hagfish and the lampreys that we saw before. So they are considered bony fish and they do have a bony skeleton. They have this operculum, and the operculum is really cool because the operculum allows them to basically create suction so that they're able to bring water into their mouth without having to swim. So with the sharks, they had to continuously swim because they weren't capable of creating that suction. So whenever the shark did not swim, they were not having water pushed over their gills. Because of the operculum, which is a bony flap that covers over the gills, they can now hold themselves in place and create that suction that brings the water in over the gills. So it's a gill cover that brings water into the mouth and pushes it over the gills. They have, in some cases, lungs. There are fish that do have lungs, and most fish do have a swim bladder. So the fish that we are going to dissect are perch, and the perch do have a swim bladder. The swim bladder is basically a big sac or like a balloon inside the fish that allows them to have buoyancy, which controls their up and down movement in the water. So it allows them to go up or down. And this is absent in the sharks. The sharks, of course, have that oil in their liver that they use instead. So again, oil is less dense than water. This is why it separates out when you put oil and water together. The oil sits on top of the water, and that's how sharks maintain their buoyancy. But fish instead have this swim bladder, which is like a balloon, and so they can go up and down in water. Now, fish are very good at surviving in aquatic habitats, and they're found in almost all aquatic habitats: lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, oceans, etc. Most places that have water, you can usually find fish of some kind in them. Lungfish are a little bit different. They do have lungs to breathe on land if necessary. Typically, they don't do a lot of breathing on land. They usually live in places that dry out frequently, or if there's a tide that goes out so that they have to, so that they're stranded on land for a little bit, or in a tide pool or something, or if they have a drought so that they get caught on land frequently enough, they can burrow into mud. A lot of times they'll go through something called aestivation, which is like a dormant period. And this dormant period helps them to survive. It's kind of like a state of suspended animation where they basically go into a really deep sleep, and this deep sleep helps them to survive like hot, dry periods. So when the area, like if they're in a pond or something, it dries out, they'll burrow into the mud and kind of go to sleep until the right conditions are met. So lungfish are typically the fish that are able to survive these kind of conditions. So within this class, we have what are called ray-finned fish, and these are the ones that they do have a swim bladder that is the air-filled sac, and sturgeon and paddlefish are found within this group. The sturgeon and paddlefish are typically larger, and these are the ones that are very much valued for their eggs because they're the eggs that are most often used for caviar. They're found mostly in freshwater environments, and we have these in the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers. When I worked for the Missouri Department of Conservation, I only worked for them for about a year as an intern, and it was a couple days. I helped out catching sturgeon and paddlefish on the Mississippi River, and we were just surveying for them. And we caught several sturgeon and paddlefish on the Mississippi River. And the ones we caught weren't very big, they were pretty small, but it was still a lot of fun to sample those.
What kind of sturgeon?
I can't remember, it was a long time ago. The common kind. We didn't find very many. It's fun though. Mostly when I worked for the NDC, we sampled, like we did research on, it was called the Niangua darter. We went in the Ozarks, and the team I was with, we surveyed for the Niangua darter, which was an endangered tiny fish. And we went into these streams, and they particularly liked fast-flowing streams, and so we snorkeled, and we would go upstream so that when we disturbed it and the water got cloudy, it would go behind us, and so we could always have a clear stream ahead of us. And the water was never very deep, it was this deep. But then once we found a Niangua darter, we would take note of the fish that were around us, and then we would estimate the size, and we do like a GPS location. So that's fun. It was a good summer. But because I was a graduate intern, they let me do other things. Like I went and helped with like the sturgeon one time, and then I got to do a couple other things. Okay, so lungfish, paddlefish, and sturgeon, just some examples of what they look like. The lungfish usually have a stockier body because, again, they have to navigate those muddy kind of areas, and so being able to dig and move through the mud is important for them. Remember that your test on Friday is going to have some identification, so make sure that you're looking at those notes that are in Google Classroom, and you're identifying the pictures, and you'll be able to tell, okay, this is a sturgeon, this is a paddlefish, and so on. Sturgeon and paddlefish aren't too hard. Sturgeon have kind of a pointy nose, and paddlefish have a long, extended paddle-like nose. That's how they get their name, paddlefish. But again, the paddlefish and the sturgeon, specifically the sturgeon, they're the ones that have the best caviar. Alright, so bony fish were used several strategies to help them swim effectively. They have streamlined bodies, so their body is kind of flattened and curved, and that streamlined effect helps the water to run off of them very smoothly and go around them so that there isn't much resistance to the water. They also have a mucus covering, and that mucus covering again is effective for helping the water to flow very smoothly around them. Their fin and their tails help them to navigate and steer through the water and propel themselves through the water. And then of course the swim bladder aids in moving up and down within the water itself. So lots of different things on their body help them to move and navigate without much resistance. It's very similar to what we'll see in birds. When birds fly through the air, they want very little resistance to the air. Fish want very little resistance to the water. So other things that are important is they have a closed circulatory system. We mentioned before like an open circulatory system where the blood kind of sloshes around inside, but that is not the case for fish. They are more advanced, so they do have a closed system, and they also have a two-chambered heart. We're not going to see a more advanced heart until we get to the more advanced animals, so we'll see a three-chambered heart in amphibians, which will be the next animal that we study. And we won't see a four-chambered heart until we get to reptiles. And in reptiles, we see a four-chambered heart in crocodiles, and then we see the four-chambered heart in birds and mammals. So really, the four-chambered heart is only in crocodiles, birds, and mammals. Reptiles such as the snake and the frog are going to have a three-chambered heart. They have a round lens in their eye, and I know I kind of mentioned this before, but the round lens will focus by going kind of back and forth. And so our lens is convex, so it is not quite flattened, but kind of bows outward, and our lens changes shape to focus. And so we have muscles in our eye that kind of pulls it to change shape. But the fish, its whole eye is the whole lens is going to move back and forth. So when we dissect the perch, I know it sounds kind of weird, but I do encourage you to explore the eye a little bit, because if you get the lens out, it is a perfectly round, clear ball, and it is very, very fascinating to see that inside the perch's eye. They can hear and smell and detect motion in the water, and they have what's called a countercurrent exchange, oxygen exchange. Now this is really important. This makes it so that their gills get the most fresh water and is the most efficient system for getting the best quality of oxygen possible. So really what's happening is the oxygen in their blood is moving one way and the water is flowing the other way, so that the deoxygenated blood is coming into contact with fresh water, and the two are running opposite each other, so counter-current to each other. So that fresh oxygen from the water is always coming into contact with deoxygenated blood, so that it can absorb as much oxygen as possible. So we'll look at a picture, and I think I have a video as well to how this works, because the idea is really quite brilliant of how they have developed this, so that they're constantly getting as much oxygen as they can from the water, because there is not a lot of oxygen available in the water for them to get. So they want to try and be as efficient as possible. Of all the animals, the organism with the best, most efficient breathing system is actually birds. Birds do the best with their breathing. They have a series of air sacs that help them to get the most air out of the environment as possible. They're better than us at breathing. We always have a little bit of stale air left over in our lungs, so our lungs don't collapse. But birds always are getting fresh air with every single breath because of the air sacs that they have. So here's how the countercurrent gill exchange works. So they have water going one way, so water going this way, and then they have the deoxygenated blood going this way. So because one's going one direction and the other's going the other direction, they are always coming into contact with the most efficient oxygen. And so the exchange is taking place to such a degree that they're able to get a high supply of oxygen necessary. I think I did have a video, but I don't think it's gonna work unless I come over here and click it.
Unlike land animals, almost all fish breathe or get their oxygen from water. Instead of using lungs, fish breathe with organs called gills. Most fish have 4 pairs of gills enclosed in a gill chamber on each side of the head. On the outside of the body, a flap of bone called a gill cover protects the gills of bony fish. To get oxygen, fish gulp water through the mouth and pump it over the gills. In many fish, the breathing process begins when the gill covers close and the mouth opens. The walls of the mouth then move inward. The mouth partially closes and the gill covers open. This action forces the water from the mouth into the gill chambers. The inside of each gill consists of fleshy, thread-like filaments. Water from the mouth passes over the filaments, The filaments are closely spaced along a gill arch in 2 rows. Each filament has many tiny extensions called lamellae. Blood flowing through the lamella takes oxygen from the water and releases carbon dioxide into the water. After the fish receives its oxygen, the water passes out through the gill openings and the breathing process begins again.
So the water comes in through the mouth and it exits through the gill operculum. And as it comes in, the blood's going to flow the opposite way, constantly bringing fresh water in over the gills and making sure it comes into deoxygenated blood from the body. Alright, so they also have something called a lateral line system. The lateral line system actually has little tiny hairs inside, and these little tiny hairs are going to allow them to detect currents and motion within the water. So this helps them to determine if there is predator or prey nearby. It helps them to detect if there is like a current in the water, so if the water is moving a certain way. Even helps them to determine if there's like frequencies and sound within the water. So this lateral line system serves many different purposes. If they are, they can even like detect tilt, like if they're starting to tilt in the water. Serves kind of a similar purpose really to like our ear does. Our ear helps us with balance and helps us with our sense of space, and that's because we have little tiny hairs on the inside of our ears. So kind of similar to that, this lateral line. We'll look at a picture on the next slide that shows where this lateral line system is on the fish, and you'll be able to see it when you dissect the perch. It's a series of dots along the side of the fish. Some fish can generate electricity, such as the electric eel, which can generate up to 500 volts of electricity, which is why it's called the electric eel. And it can be quite painful if you get, you've been shocked before, if you've ever touched like a doorknob and it's shocked you, then getting shocked with that much electricity can be quite startling also. So.
Have you seen the video of the caiman trying to eat an electric eel?
Mm-hmm.
It like bites it, then after it bites it, like all the muscles in its body like start turning on and off, so it's like shaking everywhere.
It's
weird.
crazy. That is crazy. I've seen like on some of those like daredevil shows where they dare people to do stuff and people sticking their hands in the tanks, and I've seen people do that. I wouldn't want to. Alright, so this shows the lateral line. You can see like the little tiny holes. This is just a goldfish, but if you look closely you can see the little holes on the side of the goldfish. And like I said, you will be able to see this when we dissect the perch tomorrow. And it's usually found like right along the side of the fish, and the water will come in and it'll cause kind of a disruption, and it will disrupt these tiny hairs, and you can see the tiny hairs here, and those tiny hairs will kind of wiggle, and that will be picked up by the nerves, and here's the tiny hairs. And so as those tiny hairs wiggle, it sends a message to the nerve that there has been some kind of disruption, and that'll tell the fish that something has happened, whether it is a current or some kind of change in the water. So, and kind of a similar thing happens in our ears. Our ears have tiny hairs in them, and those get disrupted when we move too quickly or when we get dizzy or something like that. Pretty cool. All right, there's also this thing called osmoregulation, which is really important for fish. Osmoregulation is water-salt balance. And with osmoregulation, you're trying to balance how much water and how much salt is inside the fish versus outside the fish. Now, this is a natural process that just occurs in nature, but we don't usually think about it because we are not often in, we take a bath or something, but we're not in water long enough that it really becomes an issue for us. And when we are in water, It's usually like a pool or a bathtub where we don't have to really think about it too much. But I'm sure you've all heard that you shouldn't drink seawater, right? Or if you are outside on a hot day, soda is usually not the best thing for you to drink, right? Well, part of that is because of this osmoregulation. If there is a lot of high concentration of something like sugars or saltiness, then water tends to flow toward that high concentration. So let's say you drink a bunch of soda. Well, water is actually going to be pulled out of your body to go toward that high concentration. So if you drink seawater, water is going to be pulled out of your body to go toward that seawater. So you actually end up more thirsty. And same with drinking a soda. Water is going to be pulled out of your body to go toward that high concentration of sugars, and so you actually end up more thirsty. So if a fish is in a salty environment, then water is going to be pulled out of that fish to go toward that salty environment. So a fish that is in a salty environment, water leaves their body naturally. So they do need to drink. They need to drink to replenish the water that is being pulled out of them. They also aren't going to urinate very much because they are trying to conserve as much water as possible. So if a saltwater fish that lives in like one of your saltwater tanks, for instance, Luke, they are not going to urinate very much and they're going to drink more often because their body is naturally losing water at a regular rate. Whereas a freshwater fish, they are more salty than their surroundings. And so they have a constant influx of water. Water is just naturally going into their salty body. And so they constantly have water just flowing into them all the time. So they naturally don't need to drink water. They don't need to because the water is always flowing into them. And so that means they are going to urinate a lot. They naturally just have, they've got so much water coming in that they need to get rid of it, so they're going to urinate a lot. Also, they don't have to drink hardly at all because they've got so much water coming in, there's no need for them to drink anymore to balance it out. So this is just a natural process. It's something that I teach my biology students about osmosis. It's also why if you put salt on a slug, the slug dies. Because you're basically taking a salty solution and the water gets sucked out. Basically, you're taking the water out of the cells of the slug. You're pulling the water out of its cells and shriveling up that poor slug by drawing the water out of its cells. Dehydrating.
Whenever I was sophomore and our biology teacher was teaching us about this, he told us a story because I was like, has anyone like consumed so much salt and not enough water to like where it was deadly? And he was like, I think he told us a story about how a girl, like she was obviously like intoxicated or something, but she wasn't getting enough water. She was drinking something that was filled with salt to like kill her because she didn't have enough water in her body. So I didn't know this. Because I always thought, because I was like, why does it I always feel like every time I eat something salty, I have to drink water. And he was like, that's why.
Because the salt naturally pulls it out.
Why does it feel like when I eat something like ice cream, like I always want water?
It doesn't have to be salt. It's anything really. Anything in a high concentration. Because it comes back to, it's anything in a high concentration that is large that can't pass through the cellular barrier. So it's a barrier that, the cellular barrier is semi-permeable. You might have heard me talking about this in biology, but the semi-permeable barrier is really small, and some things can fit through and some things can't. So it's not just salt, it's anything that can't fit through the cellular barrier. So it could be sugars, it could be proteins, it's anything that can't fit through that barrier. So if it's small enough to fit through the barrier, then it's gonna go through the barrier, and then that's diffusion. But if it's like sugars, like we have in milk, like ice cream, then that is too big to fit through the barrier too. And so water is gonna be pulled into that just as much. So, yeah, it doesn't have to be salt, it could be sugars too. So, anything that's too big to fit through the cell barrier. But it could also be that, when you eat ice cream, it takes more metabolism to warm it up. So it makes your body work harder because you're trying to warm it up too.
All living things on Earth need water because the chemical reactions that make life possible happen in an aqueous solution, which means us land animals have to drink it to keep it inside of us all the time. But what about fish? It seems like since they're always in the aqueous solution of whatever body of water they're swimming around in, they wouldn't need to actually drink the stuff. But it turns out that some fish actually do need to drink and others do not. It depends on the fish and what kind of neighborhood it lives in. Water, you should know first of all, is really into finding a balance. If you have a membrane that water can pass through and there are different concentrations of salt on each side, then the water will always flow toward the saltier side of the membrane until the concentrations on both sides are the same. That means that freshwater fish have it easy. Since the concentration of salt in their bodies is higher than the concentration in the water, that fresh water just flows right in, mainly through their gills and into their bloodstream. They also swallow some water when they eat. I mean, it's kind of unavoidable, but they don't need to actively gulp down water. But in order to retain the balance of concentrations, the fish's tissues still need to have some salt in them. And that's where chloride cells come in. These are special cells in the gills that produce large amounts of an enzyme that controls the flow of dissolved salts like sodium and potassium across cell membranes. So in freshwater fish, these chloride cells work hard to bring just the right amount of salt into the fish's bloodstream. Now saltwater fish have the opposite problem. For most of them, the concentration of salt in the water is higher than the concentration in their blood. That means that as they pass water over their gills to breathe, the higher concentration of salt outside of their body is constantly sucking water out of them. So these fish have to drink a lot, which they just gulp down by the mouthful. But since the only water around is salty, they have to filter out the salt to make it safe for them to absorb. A lot of that salt is filtered out in the fish's kidneys, but these fish have chloride cells in their gills too, so that in their case, those cells are constantly pumping salts out of their bloodstream and into the saltier water. So they may be surrounded by water, but no matter where they live, fish are always looking to find that balance. Thanks for asking. If you have a quick question you'd like to ask us, we're down in the comments.
So it's not just that, there are other things like the chloride cells that are trying to help out as well.
So what happens if like a saltwater fish ended up in freshwater?
It would die.
And vice versa.
Yeah. Okay, so other things about the fish that help them to survive often lay hundreds or thousands of eggs. Since many of them won't survive till adulthood, we talked about the different strategies that different animals have. One of the strategies being that let's lay bunches of eggs in the hopes that, a couple survive. This was the Finding Nemo theory, that let's lay a bunch of eggs and then Nemo is the only one that survives. And then the other one is let's have 1 or 2 babies and invest a lot of time and care into those 1 or 2 babies, and this is the strategy that humans have. So we have just a couple kids and then we invest a lot of time and care and effort into those couple kids to make sure that they do survive. Fish will often mate in large schools and all spawning or release eggs and sperm at the same time. And that way that there's a lot of mixing happening, and hopefully all those eggs and sperm get mixed up and all those eggs and sperm will find each other within that time frame. Most of them are oviparous, means that the eggs are going to develop outside the female, so they'll lay their eggs outside and the eggs develop and hatch outside. Many fish do not care for their eggs or young. Some of them do. Some of them do care for their young and protect their eggs, but many of them just lay them and leave them. But some of them do care for them. When I worked on my thesis research, I bred zebrafish. That was our thing. It was easy to breed them in a lab. We put the males and the females together, and then a couple times a week I put like a breeding basket in there and we put some grass in there and then left it overnight, and then in the morning I'd go collect them, and the females would go in there and lay the eggs at night in this little like fake grass thing, and I would collect the eggs in the morning, and it was pretty easy. But the females just laid them and that was it. Some fish brood or do take care of their young. Their young can be taken care of in their mouth or in pouches. If you think of a seahorse, for instance, the male will take care of them in the pouch. There are some that have special like pouches in their throat, so it looks like they swallow the young, but they actually are caring for them in like a throat pouch. And so they like spit out the young, and then the little like fish fry come back in and swim into their mouth, and they get swallowed again for protection. So some of them do care for their young, not all of them. Do you breed any of your fish, Luke?
Not yet.
Not yet? Is that a plan for the future?
Yeah.
What are you gonna breed?
Clownfish, hopefully.
It'd be fun.
I heard that they're fairly easy.
Is it like Nemo where there's an anemone? You have to breed around the anemone?
I think it makes it easier, but it's not necessary. You can also do soft corals that kind of move like anemones, and they will I forget what the word is, but they'll like live in there and swim around the room and stuff like that.
Zebrafish, like I said, they were pretty easy. He just like stuck a little plastic thing on the outside, like clipped to the tank, and then you put some fake grass in there, and you left it in overnight, and then the egg sunk to the bottom. And you collected it in the morning, and you use like a eyedropper, and you suck the eggs out, and then you just collect them. Pretty easy. So here's a mouth brooder, and you can see all the little babies in its mouth. And here's a seahorse, and it's the males that have the babies. You can see a little baby in the pouch. The seahorses are very weird. They're like a fish, but their tail, they're like an upright fish, and their tail is used to hook onto things so they don't drift away. And they've got the little babies in the pouch, and it's the male that takes care of these. Alright, so these are just fun facts. You don't have to write these down, but they're really weird. The anglerfish. So the anglerfish lives in the deep ocean in the dark, and so it is very hard for the male to find a female. So when the male does find a female, he attaches to her and he becomes a part of her. Like he grows into her and becomes part of her blood supply. And so he is like a little vestigial part of her, and he like dies and actually becomes a part of her, and her blood supply like supports him. And so they are always together. And he's just like a little like appendage of her now.
And those are the ones like on, you know.
Yep. The little dangly things, and the little dangly thing is a bacteria, like a little like bacteria that lights up. So, but yeah, because they live in the dark ocean, so once they finally find each other, he never wants to let go, and so he is her constant sperm supply, and so he becomes a part of her. It's really gross and weird. Yeah. The flounderfish starts off as a regular fish, but then it will lay on the ground on its side, and then its eyeball will come from the side and migrate to the top of its head. So its its eye starts on the side and then it migrates to the top of its head.
Yeah, that's how you put two eyes on one side.
Yep. So that's another weird one. And then most fish are dark on the top and light on the bottom, and same with birds as well. And so that way, if you're looking down, it's darker, but if you're looking up, it's lighter, and that contrast in color helps them to camouflage. And this is the same for birds too. Birds are darker on top, so if you're looking down, it blends in with the ground, and if you're looking up, it kind of blends in with the sky. Fish have growth rings on their scales, kind of like the rings on a tree, to help them camouflage, or not camouflage, but to help them count how old they
They
are.
go by eggs, but they're trying to.
And then some fish can produce 300 million eggs at a time. That's a whole lot of eggs. That's a whole lot of eggs.
Way
Way too many eggs. Alright, and so this is a perch, so this is the one we'll be dissecting, one similar to this. Seahorse, pufferfish, obviously they puff up to protect themselves. Clownfish, rainbow trout, flounder. Here's his eyes, so you can see how his eyes kind of mushed together. Because this one used to be over here, but it kind of rotated like upwards. So now he's got two eyes on one side of his head.
So they're sort of like upright.
I don't know if they can once they lay down like that. So I think once they lay like that, they stay like that. And they, once they decide that that's their bottom, that stays their bottom. Yeah, because their eye just like flips like that. And then there's the anglerfish at the bottom. I don't know if I've got a picture of his appendage, like a little middle appendage. And then the cavefish. The cavefish are totally blind and colorless. Yeah, they have no eyes anymore. Like there used to be an eye there. They don't have eyes anymore. All right. And shark and perch dissection prep. We will dissect the perch tomorrow. Hopefully Elena's here.